Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Faria, and I am at Chiboktuk, the Great Harbor in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, who signed treaties of peace and friendship with the British Crown in the 1700s that are still in effect to this day. As important as it is to acknowledge that, it's vital to have that understanding be the foundation of our collective decisions and actions on this land as well. I'm so glad you could all join us tonight for today's International Women's Day panel, Addressing Women's Housing Needs in Halifax, Exposing the Intersections of Invisibility. We came together tonight because housing insecurity and homelessness for women is largely made invisible. Women, especially those who are marginalized in multiple ways, face systemic barriers to accessing safe, affordable, and adequate housing. Women have also been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, especially racialized women, low-waged workers, single parents, disabled women, women who have had no safe home, who may fear losing custody of their children. And at the same time, the housing support sector is dominated by primarily women workers who provide necessary services, often for low wages and without benefits. We need to address the intersections of women and gender diverse people's lives that often make them invisible to government agendas. They are often underserved by systems and services and should be a priority in the recovery and in a just transition. There are two organizations that collaborated to bring this event together tonight. The Local Council of Women, which I am a part, has been active in Halifax for over 125 years, providing a space for women to collaborate on what each generation saw as neglected but necessary contributions to the public good. Members of the council have campaigned over the decades for rights of suffrage, access to clean water. They've founded schools, colleges, and hospitals, developed playgrounds, and provided housing for women and children. Today, the council continues to provide a community space for events and gatherings, hosting small businesses and nonprofits in our South End Heritage House. And since 1999, the Nova Scotia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has sought to provide greater balance to public policy in this province and to show that there are choices and alternatives to the status quo. They focus on promoting a participatory, transparent, and democratically accountable approach to public policy development in Nova Scotia. And they work to raise debate and propose recommendations that might achieve an economically and socially just, as well as environmentally sustainable province for all of us. Their publications cover issues important to Nova Scotians. In 2021 alone, they updated the Living Wage in Nova Scotia report, produced a 2021 report card on child and family poverty in Nova Scotia, and the Housing for All report brought together 40 plus community researchers, direct service providers, and activists to produce 95 recommendations for providing affordable, accessible housing for everyone in Nova Scotia. They are proudly funded by Nova Scotians, and it's because of Nova Scotian donors, volunteers, and research associates that they can do the work that they do. We have 4 amazing speakers joining us tonight. Jen Powley had to stop working because her voice was compromised because of her progressive multiple sclerosis, so she wrote a book instead. Jen's been active in disability advocacy, working for Independent Living Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunity, and the Ecology Action Centre. Her book, Just Jen, was the winner of the Margaret and John Savage First Book Award for nonfiction. Jen has a master's in urban planning and most recently earned a master's of fine arts in creative nonfiction. Cheryl McIsaac is a Chiboktuk, Halifax-based feminist who works in housing and homelessness. She has been employed with ADSM for Women and Children for nearly 15 years and advocates for feminist, anti-oppressive approaches to housing solutions for women, gender-expansive folks, youth, and children. She's a Taurus, a cat person, and a hopeful cynic. Cathy Mellett has been a long-term advocate for affordable housing since arriving in Halifax in the early 80s. Her first job in the 80s housing crisis was as a researcher for the Dartmouth Social Services and the then Women's Emergency Housing Coalition in their efforts to establish the first emergency shelter for women and children. Then as housing consultant for the city of Halifax, working to establish co-op and nonprofit housing projects in partnership with the municipality, NS Housing, and CMHC. She was one of the founders of the Halifax Women's Housing Co-op and then became the operations manager of the Halifax Housing Authority, trying to bring a community development model to that organization. Her interest and passion for affordable housing has been reignited by her work with newcomers and the latest housing affordability crisis. And our last speaker, Martha Mitali, was born in Zambia and grew up in Nova Scotia. She is a poet, a community connector, and an advocate. When the first wave of the pandemic hit, Martha worked at the 3 pop-up shelters that were organized by Affordable Housing of Nova Scotia. She joined the YWCA in 2020 as a housing support worker. And in her current role, Martha supports participants in the Supportive Housing for Young Women's program. Letters are confusing me. Supportive Housing for Young Mothers program as they transition to independent living. And Martha is a member of the Build Together Regional Housing Committee, a group of housing representatives from all over Nova Scotia advocating for better living conditions for those living in rural and urban communities. She resides in the north end of Halifax, where she's lived and worked for the past 5 years. And I got through all of that in the time allotted. Yes, okay, we have 3 big questions, and each of our 4 speakers has 3 minutes to answer each one. Our first question is, what do you think are the major challenges facing women and gender diverse people who are housing insecure or homeless in Nova Scotia or in Halifax? Can we start with Jen?
I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of Carrie Ernst, Executive Director of Independent Living Nova Scotia, and Jerry Costa, the Executive Director of the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunity. I think people working trying to house people need to remember to be flexible. No 2 people with disability, even if it is the same disability, will need the same thing. There are commonalities. Most women with disability are in poverty. They are typically 1 paycheck away from eviction. This means women who have a higher rate of disability than do men and earn less than men typically do are particularly vulnerable. There are many disabilities, so if you say someone is disabled, you probably need to elaborate. When I was on the province's Built Environment Standards Development Committee, we were trying to make buildings accessible for people with 7 types of disability, some having conflicting needs. The range of disability we were looking at included people who are blind or visually impaired, people who are deaf or hearing impaired, people with communication disorders, people who are mobility impaired, people who are neurodivergent, which includes people who are autistic, people with intellectual disability, people with psychiatric disability. I apologize if I forgot any labels. Some people might have problems finding a suitable place to live. Others might have problems maintaining that place. There are a variety of issues. One of the biggest problems for people with severe physical disability is the need for attendant care, as well as for the 4 walls of the house. Nova Scotia does not provide 24-hour attendant care outside of an institution. This is a huge barrier which has left over 300 younger adults in nursing homes. I think a lot of people who have houselessness can fit into the province's definition of disabled, which states disability means a physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment that, in the interaction with the barrier, hinders an individual's full and effective participation in society. So, when the province set a goal of becoming fully accessible by 2030, it didn't really know how big of a task it was tackling. Disability can strike all people no matter their sex/gender identification, age, race, or lifestyle. The Department of Community Services is hopelessly behind in providing adequate spaces and funding. When you ask what the biggest challenges are for women and gender diverse people, I also include people with disability, we all need to remember to be kind as we approach the other. I was reading an article about the history of institutionalization. It mentioned that it was easy for society to justify putting people with disability in institutions because people with disability were seen as others. When we realize the others are not that different from ourselves or that people we love and or respect are included in the category of other, it makes the problem much more complicated. We realize that we could just as easily be a member of that class of the other. This makes it much harder to justify treating the other any differently than we ourselves would want to be treated.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer, Jen. Cheryl, can you answer the question next? What do you think are the major challenges faced by women and gender diverse people who have who are housing insecure or homeless?
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for inviting me today. It's really great to see so many faces out there, some familiar and some not. But yeah, my name's Cheryl McIsaac, and I've worked for ADSM for women and children for nearly 15 years. We see folks at different, I guess, stages of homelessness and precarious housing, from our emergency shelter to the folks that we support that are housed or precariously housed. So we do get to learn from the experiences, diverse experiences of lots of folks. When I first saw this question, the first thing that jumped out for me was, money, lack of affordable housing, all the obvious pieces. People need more money. But really, the structural barriers are the most challenging. Poverty is certainly the single most common denominator, and women and gender diverse folks are more likely to be poor than cis men. And the more marginalized you are, the more complex your experiences are of oppression, and the more vulnerable you then are to becoming homeless. Women and gender diverse folks are more likely to be invisibly homeless, and visibly so too. So I think that often people can conjure up images of folks sleeping rough, and sometimes the folks that we see and work with don't see themselves in those images. The people that we see that are most at risk include single mothers and trans parents, and women and gender expansive folks who are leaving abusive relationships, certainly. Women and gender diverse folks who are members of racialized groups. Certainly African, Nova Scotian women and Indigenous women are significantly overrepresented in the homeless and precariously housed populations in HRM. And women and folks living with disabilities and older women. So what we also see too is that poverty is not experienced as just a lack of material resources like money that I mentioned. That's a big one, but an absence of supports and human resources like community supports or friends and family. We see a lot of people in isolation who just have no one, and when we're looking to sometimes help folks with immediate situations or emergency situations of homelessness, and we're trying to divert folks from shelter and try to find if there's any other solution possible. Can we help you stay with a family member? Is there somewhere else where you can be tonight? The resounding response to that is just people often don't have anyone, or the folks that they do have in their lives are also very vulnerable, and therefore experiencing a lot of the same, the same oppressions, the same struggles. Isolation too definitely has been exacerbated by COVID. So we've certainly seen a lot of folks struggling in that regard. Current policies that support those that experience poverty aren't designed to address the structural oppression that so many folks are experiencing, and the result is punitive. Definitely, and rather than empowering. And so the systems that are in place ignore the systemic causes of poverty and instead focus on individual circumstances. And, the better that folks are at performing assigned gender or social class, we have this system where, it's still, we see deserving poor and undeserving poor. I mean, no one would say that, but that's how people experience it. And the better you are, or the more resourced you are at performing in a particular way, the better you're going to be at accessing those services. And the more you resist or deviate from that sort of expected performance, whether it be gender or otherwise, the more marginalized you are, the less helpful those systems are going to be. Complex trauma and intergenerational trauma are definitely like another super common challenge that we see for folks, and they're inextricably linked to poverty. Notions of trauma-informed care are not new. We've been talking about trauma for well over 10 years, I think, but virtually none of the policies and services that police homeless folks or precariously housed people are trauma-informed. So even where there is knowledge of trauma-informed approaches, the very settings where people are trying to access services are not. Congregate settings, for example, in our shelters, hugely challenging for folks who are suffering from trauma. And policies that appear neutral on the surface, obviously anyone who's here tonight knows that they have very gendered and racial cultural biases attached. They're informed by Eurocentric ways of knowing, with a focus on individual versus community or collective needs. And, you know, those are rooted in capitalist and patriarchal assumptions. An example that comes to mind, and we see it all the time, is when women who are most often the, you know, single leads of single-led family households, if or when their children are removed from their care by child protection, automatically they don't receive their child tax benefit, and most families are using that money in order to, you know, supplement rent and provide places for their families to be. And so once they don't have that income anymore, they become homeless, and then they're then dealing with the trauma of having had their children removed and then being homeless in the very same moment. But then they're asked to you know, deal and can complete a number of tasks in order to have their children return to their care while having to manage and being homeless at the same time. So that's one policy that like is very obviously biased and could change. Like that could change for so many people. It's an easy fix. And we see often too, like even folks who are in public housing, if their children are removed from their care, then they may need to leave a unit that has multiple bedrooms, etc. And so that's one way in which policies certainly impact homelessness, and we see it really frequently. I think also just in general, like we're seeing a mixed bag at ADSM. We definitely do see folks who are, it's their first encounter, their first time being homeless. COVID has definitely exacerbated that. We've seen more often women who are middle-aged to not quite senior who have been housed throughout their lives, but something has changed. Either an illness, disability, or a spouse has passed away. Some circumstances changed where they're encountering systems for the first time. And often those folks are, you know, they're invisible, they're sleeping in cars or what have you, but they've run out of those resources. And we're seeing lots of folks too reach out who are just living in uninhabitable circumstances. So maybe they've had to move out to more like rural areas. We've seen people who are living without running water or heat. But they're afraid often. They don't seek service or support because if there are children involved, they're worried then that their kids might be removed from their care. And we see lots of people managing their own trauma by using substances, and with no safe supply, folks who are using are repeatedly criminalized, super stigmatized. They often need them to support their use through unsafe work. And landlords, like frankly, can afford to be picky. So, you know, often that stigma and all of those judgments that folks have to live with on a regular basis, it's compounded if folks are racialized or gender diverse. And so we're seeing that all the time. Again, yeah, common denominator, certainly poverty, but I think that people need to expand their ideas of what poverty means. It's not just about a lack of income, it's about a lack of all of the possible resources folks can have. Thanks.
Thank you so much for getting into that, the different ways that systems are not designed to be navigable. and how our notions of poverty are sometimes inadequate. Can we turn to Cathy for an answer to the question?
Thanks so much. And hello, everyone. It's great to see you or not see you, know you're there. I just want to jump on top of what Cheryl was saying because it was so profound. We're probably all going to hear the words poverty or lack of a living wage or income, discrimination coming from all sorts of factors when there is no affordable housing supply, and there is none. When we look at a vacancy rate like of less than 1%, let's be clear, all of those vacancies are in the higher end rentals. They're not in the lower end rentals. There is simply no housing out there that's affordable for people on what they're being given. I think probably I'm talking to the people who are converted, but social assistance rates in Nova Scotia are criminal. You simply cannot live on them. You cannot rent an apartment on them. You cannot feed yourself and your children on them. You probably can't live in an apartment and feed yourself and your children on double what social assistance rates are, let alone pensions. And so I just want to make visible sort of three people who I've worked with in the last year. The first is a mom who arrived with her daughter here in Canada in the middle of COVID, like 2 weeks before lockdown, and was on that social assistance or federal rate. And so she was very fortunate. She actually found an apartment, a bachelor apartment at one of the better low-income landlords. So she and her daughter were in lockdown for the first year. Her daughter not in school, hadn't been in school for several years, in a bachelor apartment, one bed. They had nothing but the computer, the bed, and a kitchen table for that period of time. And the way that they were provided with groceries was the Red Cross grant, COVID grant that the organization I was working with was able to forward to them, because 90% of their income was going towards that rent of that bachelor apartment. So I think any of us who are parents, grandparents, or have kids in our lives know what type of stress that meant. Since then, the person was able to get the child tax credit late, and got a chunk of money that they were able to put towards some furniture, some help. It's those supports that Cheryl was talking about, they're so important that people don't have in their lives when they're dealing with poverty and those types of things. The second is a story of a woman whose children were separated from her for she and her children for 5 years, and were finally reunited here in Canada. She has worked since 2 weeks after arrival in Canada, cobbling together low-income minimum wage jobs, most of whom those employers are never going to give you 40 hours a week. They're going to give you 20 so that there's no benefits. So she has 2 and sometimes 3 of those jobs. Sometimes one ends, another one has to start. She's worked 7 days a week, 40 to 60 hours a week to have her children finally arrive. We were able to find her a year and a half ago, a 3-bedroom apartment at a little under $1,000 a month, which was amazing at the time. But that building is now being sold and purchased. And so she is in that apartment now until the Emergency Measures Act ends and renovations can happen again. And she tried to cut a deal with the new landlord for $1,500 for the apartment that's going to be there. And that wasn't acceptable because they were prepared and only would accept $1,800 a month. And so she's just holding her own, trying to find something with supports. And of course, there is nothing out there for her. So when the renovation happens, she and her family will have nowhere to go, in spite of the fact that, she's working 7 days a week, 40 to 60 hours a week, trying to create a new life for her and her family here in Canada. And the last is a young man who has a long-term disability, who I know very intimately as a family member, who his social assistance was, $383 because he was boarding, and was forced to apply for his very limited CPP. Thankfully, that policy's changed. But he now is getting $550 a month because the people he was boarding with wrote that letter to social assistants to say that, you know, the rent was going to, that boarding rent was going to be charged. It's a family member, and has been living on that for the last 10 years. So the only way that young man survives is through family support. And if you don't have that, you simply cannot survive. It's not a matter of will you survive, but you can't survive. So those, you know, those are faces that we want to make public to, you know, say that this is what it looks like in Nova Scotia. So of course, it's poverty, it's multiple things that Cheryl talked about. It's the discrimination that landlords can and do because they have the choice. And it's also the fact that there simply has, through years of ignorance and lack of attention, there aren't sufficient units within Nova Scotia to house people at an affordable rate. And that's where we are. And sadly, 40 years ago, this is where we were, and here we are again. But I think together, you know, that's why we're meeting tonight and why we need to talk about it more.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Cathy. It's certainly true that weak tenant protections and low housing supply and multiple dimensions of social policy are combining to make this horrible cocktail of housing precariousness in Nova Scotia. Can we go to Martha for an answer to the question? What are the major challenges faced by women and gender diverse people for housing security?
Hello and good evening. Thank you for having me tonight. So my current position at SHIM, SHIM is supportive housing for young mothers, and it's in the housing department within the YWCA. And the age group is 16 to 24 years old. And my job is I support the participants as they're exiting the supportive housing and preparing them for independent living. And that comes with a variety of like scenarios and situations and barriers. And some of the things that I've learned. So I started at SHIM about 1.5 years ago, and it's been a learning curve. There is no housing for anybody that is 16 years old, let alone 20 years old, with a budget that is, if anyone's been on Kijiji lately, it's impossible to put somebody in a building right now. And it comes with so much more than just placing them in a unit. You have to make sure that they have, like, utilities are hooked up, and if they're a minor, it's a whole other situation where if they're also in care, there are particular steps that you have to take, contacting their worker, figuring out all the different financial pieces. And some of the participants, they don't have the best relationship with their family. So when we're talking about housing issues, it's hard to house somebody when they don't have a support system. I don't know how anybody would stay housed. Like it's impossible, basically. There's so many layers to staying housed. And even just listening to some of the other panelists, I just remembered my first viewing with a client, and I've supported people with housing outside of this job, but this experience I've never experienced anything like this before. We arrived and we were on time. There were 2 women on their balcony. We weren't there to meet them, but they took it upon themselves to say a lot of very negative things to the mom that I was with. And it was really disappointing, because it was unsolicited, you know, like they didn't need to say anything to us whatsoever. And my client, she does have a lot of anxiety issues. And so trying to navigate in that moment, like calming down the client, and also like, do I even approach these people? What do I say to them? And just trying to figure out all those like small pieces when it comes to supporting somebody who needs to be housed. And I remember telling my boss, and I was just like, I don't know how to feel about this because I wasn't expecting it. And I just went to go for an apartment meeting with someone, and now I'm angry. And so it's situations like that where it's like you can't be angry in the moment, but you can't express your anger in front of your client because they are relying on you to get them through that moment. And some other barriers that I have definitely noticed would be access to internet, also access to phones. If I'm trying to connect with a client, phone numbers change constantly, and it's just a matter of like, how do you reach out to these individuals? So yeah, those are some of the challenges that I've faced. Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Martha. We have our second question, which is, in your experiences thus far, what has worked and what lessons have you learned from moving forward to addressing the needs of women and gender diverse people right now? Can we start with Cheryl, please?
Hi, sure. Sorry, I've got a cough drop going on here. What has worked? I was chatting with a colleague about this the other day, and we were like, nothing's worked, nothing is working. That's not true. Obviously, we have a housing crisis that's been going on forever. There's a housing emergency. Digging deep, I think what can work is just what we need is greater flexibility in stretching limits. And I think that anytime, at least within my role at ADSM, that anytime we find something that does work, it takes a lot of dedicated folks from various teams really kind of bending whatever we can to make something happen, to make something come into place. So I think it takes a lot of flexibility when it comes to, and evolving policies as well, that we're always checking ourselves to make sure that as service providers, we're not replicating dynamics of oppression, and we're always working harder to do a better job at that. You know, I think like in how language changes over time, and it should, and how we often employ the language of choice when we're working with folks who are using services for housing services. And what bullshit that is, because in the sense that with such limited choices, there is no true agency there. But in terms of what I said, I describe myself as a hopeful cynic. So that's true. The hope, I think, is that we have seen some things evolve. I mean, what comes to mind too, again, from the ADSM perspective, is like over 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, we didn't have a trans inclusion policy. So folks who were turning up at the shelter, for example, weren't necessarily receiving services. That is bananas to me now in retrospect, that you know, and that is now a thing that exists, or harm reduction policy, for example, and how that's evolved over time to accommodate the needs of folks. And I think that we need to always be reflexive and flexible as service providers when we're like designing those policies. The same needs, of course, to be extended to all services and levels of programs that exist for supporting folks who are homeless. I think too, in terms, we got to be pragmatic, and when we're thinking long-term about whatever new projects we might be able to be involved in developing, thinking about people, like not just the band-aid solutions of in the moment, but so much of housing work is that, right? Like this, can we get this person from outside to inside for the night? Can we, you know, those solutions, that's always going to be there. But thinking long-term about projects when we're designing new things, like how can we make sure people can age in place, because the needs of a person that we might be able to house today are going to change over time. Like families will grow. Somebody could, what are you experience an illness, accident, etc., and things change. And how can we make sure that we are thinking about that in the long term? If we are, and always being too, like, again, like with the reflexivity piece, always trying to do better, consulting other people, not working in silos, to make sure that we're doing the work of examining those policies, including first voice folks. We know that we need to be doing more of that, and when we do, it's super helpful. So not just for the people using the services, but for us as providers to have those lenses. So we need more first voice folks making decisions and driving policies and practices. There's so many more people that could speak to this better than I could. But I think just definitely being pragmatic and forward thinking when we embark on new programs and projects is essential. Thinking about accessibility, thinking about trauma all the time, like if we're actually, you know, what's happening with the spaces that we're able to provide people with, like just off the top of my head. That's just a bit of that. But I think certainly that the more we involve people and their own housing decisions, the better we can do, knowing of course that the options are really limited. And so doing the work of trying to make the more options available for people. That's what works.
Thank you so much for that, Cheryl.
Mm-hmm.
Can we have Jen's answer for our round 2 question? In your experience, what works and what lessons have you learned for addressing immediate needs now?
One of the few benefits of having a disability is the ability to make a claim for CPP disability. There are a lot of criteria you need to meet in order to be eligible. If you contributed enough to CPP, then you might qualify if you are lucky enough to have a doctor who will fill out the form for you and are lucky enough to be informed of the program in the first place. You will have had to have worked, so it's not a benefit for people who have a severe congenital disability. I get CPP disability because I was able to be employed until I was 35. There is also a disability tax credit, but you have to earn income before you can get income tax back. At the start of COVID-19, the Canadian government gave vouchers to people whose employment was affected. It had terms of a guaranteed living income, a program which had been tested in Manitoba in the 1970s to great outcomes. The government never acted on it, probably because it feared it would cause massive inflation. This type of program would have a lot of benefits for persons with disability. If you have a serious enough disability, where the medical establishment thinks you ought to be hospitalized or put in a nursing home, you will likely not be sleeping on the streets. You will probably be in a hospital or move to a nursing home, but this does not exclude you from feeling homelessness, nor does it mean you will be safe from violence. Women with disability are particularly prone to abuse. They are not able to defend themselves, and it is fairly easy to prevent a rapid getaway. I read an article about how murder rates are higher in nursing homes than in large Canadian cities. I can only assume that the same holds true for other crimes. If you receive CPP disability, you can likely afford to cohabit with another individual and share a low-cost apartment. If you can't afford food because of the living cost, you can visit the food bank. Most people who are disabled would not qualify for special income assistance or CPP disability. They would be like any other individual who needs support. If you're stuck waiting for the Department of Community Services, you will have to wait in line just like everyone else. I have learned that you need to push government to make things happen. I propose to the Department of Community Services that there be an option for 24-hour support outside of an institution. There is no good reason why 24-hour support cannot be provided in the community. The proposal I put in November of 2019 was approved. I am working with Independent Living Nova Scotia to make it a reality. We have 2 condos next to each other in South End, Halifax. Renovations are starting this week. I don't know why government needed an idea from the community in order to make this happen, but it is happening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Jen. And can we go to Cathy for an answer to that question?
So what works?
What works?
It's like Cheryl said, it's hard to see sometimes, but things work. Things work when people are prepared to make them work and to fight hard to make them work. So organizations like Acorn, who are trying to advocate for renters and to make the Residential Tenancies Act more equitable in its relationship between landlords and tenants. That works. And it, you know, it may not work today, it may not work tomorrow, but it works because it's about renters agency. It's about taking power and insisting that you be heard. Co-op and nonprofit housing works. It worked in the 70s and 80s. There's still hundreds of units out there for people who are living affordably because they're in co-op and nonprofit housing units. If I was to tell another story, it would be about another young woman with a child who was going through some really rough times, and through some advocacy was able to get a unit in a co-op, and it's changed her life. It's allowed her to keep her child, to get back into the workforce, to get what she needed with supports from others. But it was really that housing stability that provided that. And you may not know them and you may not see them, but literally there are hundreds of units in Halifax, Dartmouth, HRM, where people are living affordably with control and input into their own lives because they're in co-op and nonprofit units. They work. Deep subsidies to private landlords work. Unfortunately, it just puts more money in their pockets, but for the people who are having them and living there, it means that they have an affordable unit. And if we combine all of those things, I'm an advocate for continuing those landlord subsidies, those deep subsidies, because they work for the people who live there. Collaboration, and I think Cheryl talked about that in the agenda too. Collaboration and partnerships work. Just recently, the nonprofit that I've been engaged with recognized that one of the only ways to get some stable housing for young newcomers coming was to take the risk to rent an apartment and to find the subsidy dollars independently from fundraising to do that. And that's a risk that they took because it was necessary. How long it can be sustained, I don't know, but it was something that they chose to do because it was necessary to do it. And those types of collaboration and resources and ability, the folks who are out there on the front lines with at the tent cities and advocating for real supportive housing for people coming off the streets, because support is necessary because of trauma and all of those things. Those fights, those are necessary, those are possible. We're going to talk about some visioning, and I'll save some of my other comments for that. But all of those things are working, have worked, will continue to work. And I think we have to remember that.
Thank you so much, Cathy. Martha, in your experience, what works, what will work now?
So I was actually just thinking about a young mom that was housed. She moved out of Shim last year, and she's successfully still in her unit and doing very well. But it was the process that it took to get her into that unit. So with Shim, the participants sign a lease specifically for Shim. And it gets renewed according to like whatever start date and end date. But then for this particular young mom, some of the hiccups that some of the hiccups that the clients that I've worked with have encountered is not even getting a viewing. And so with the support of the Y and another housing organization, we were able to get this mom into a unit, and it definitely took like a little bit of arm twisting because finding something within her budget, it wasn't happening. But when I think about that particular scenario, I remember the ED sending an email just to even like acknowledge the steps that it took to get this young mom into that unit. And I was just like, wow, it shouldn't be this complicated. It really shouldn't be this hard to get a young mom and her toddler housed, but it is. And I think some of the other things that I think have popped up is a lack of culturally appropriate services. That's a big deal right now. Trying to find resources and supports to keep the mom housed, excuse me, is really, really challenging, because I've had conversations with some clients where they don't feel comfortable talking to their particular supports for a variety of different reasons, and having to navigate that conversation so they can recognize what the priority is, and acknowledge that, okay, if this is where I'm at, let's take those steps, and helping them figure that out. I love that part of the process. It's been really challenging, but I love connecting with people and helping them really figure out, like, if you're going to be housed, what do you need to stay housed, and how can we get that for you? Yeah.
Thank you for speaking to that process. Okay, our last question, number 3, is what is your vision for how we address housing needs for women and gender diverse people going into the future? And I'm hopeful for this. But Cathy, would you be able to start us off?
Sure, thanks for doing that. If you haven't looked at the Canadian Centres for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia report on keys to the housing security future for all Nova Scotians, do that. They've got great recommendations. I'll give them a plug for that. And some of mine are going to be similar to that. First of all, we've got to deal with poverty in Nova Scotia. We find that we have to. The social assistance rates have to be tied to CMHC median rentals. So when you're saying $500 for housing on social assistance, it's not $500, it needs to be $1,500. And if you say you get like $300 for food, you know, StatsCan says the average family of 4 spends $1,000 a month on food. So we need to address that. And if the province can't address it because of their perceived budget problems, there's other solutions, like allowing people to work in addition to their social assistance up to equal amounts, not like a couple of $100 before you start clawing it back, but up to equal amounts. So that if they get a chance to work, they can build skills, they can have income, they can do all of those types of things. The child benefit is not a subsidy for the province of Nova Scotia. It's supposed to be a payment to parents so that they can provide some sort of future for their children. And the province of Nova Scotia is treating it like a subsidy to their budget. And that's got to end. And we have to be vocal about that. And we have to be angry about that. And we need to be very clear about that. Whose budget is this subsidizing? It's not, shouldn't be the province of Nova Scotia. We have to be clear about the fact that the minimum wage in Nova Scotia is not even close to a living wage. I think Christine can correct me, but I think it's $22, not $13.25 or 40 cents or whatever it is. When I know the parents who are working 50 and 60 and 70 hours at 3 jobs at $3.75 an hour and still not being able to feed their children, that's not acceptable. And so rather than have a minimum wage that goes up to 15 in 2024, like the promise has been, the minimum wage needs to be 15 tomorrow and then 22 by 2024. That's, you know, there's many people out there working their asses off and can't rent an apartment and can't feed their families. That's not acceptable. And we have to be clear about that. And if a business can't run by paying their employees a living wage, then they should close and not run. That's what we need to be adamant and clear about. We need the government to stop thinking that the only solution to affordable housing is the private sector, private developers, because that's not what their interest is. Their interest is in profit and in people like me who can rent apartments. at $1,800, $2,200, $2,400 a month. That's not has never provided housing, affordable housing. The people who have provided affordable housing are the government themselves through public housing, and through co-op and nonprofit housing. And we need a program. They've proven they could do it. They've done it before. The 1980s problem was a problem of interest rates. Today's problem is a problem of affordability. And so it takes a different solution than the old co-op nonprofit program, but they know how to create those solutions. Basically a forgivable grant for the down payment and deep subsidies guaranteed to co-op and nonprofits so that they can know what their operating costs are going to be each month, and it's going to meet real affordability needs of people. And then let the community and the people do it, because we've done it before. There's lots of nonprofits out there and lots of people who would organize themselves to do it. And it needs to be, and the province has done some good things in the past. If they had a will, the whole community of Sackville, Nova Scotia was created through the Department of Housing in Nova Scotia as affordable family housing, and they did a damn good job. If they chose to, they could do it again. They could put infrastructure in place. Perfect example, Exhibition Park was sitting there. It was prime land. It could have been a mobile home park, a beautiful mobile home park. They do have such things. Instead, they sold it to a private developer. That's not acceptable. The province needs to use its resources for the people of Nova Scotia, not to subsidize its budget. And if we all do that together, but if we're really clear about the fact that Residential Tenancies Act needs to be more equitable between tenants and landlords, there needs to be investment in social housing at all sorts of levels. There needs to be a program that works, and there needs to be real living wages for people on income assistance and workers in Nova Scotia. Until that changes, nothing will change. But it's a vision that's doable. And I think the people who talked about, what happened for COVID, what happens in times of crisis, this is a crisis. The government can choose to do it if they want to. And I think we, the people, need to make them accountable to us for the fact that it needs to be done.
Thank you so much for sharing that today, Cathy. I am hoping that we can hear from Martha. Martha, what is your vision? How can we move forward? And what should we be moving to?
That's a great question that I don't have an answer to, but I think over the last few months, I've just been really thinking about mental health resources and how they need to be improved and they need to be expanded, not just within urban communities, but rural communities as well. I think we need to also acknowledge that the language around housing, it really isn't friendly. And being able to explain to people what's going on in housing, a lot of folks are just I don't know what you're talking about. So I think making the conversation around housing, bring as many people into the conversation, because it really is a community. It takes a community, it takes a village. And I just kind of have really been thinking about the different ways to bring resources together, bring people together. And yeah, can we really end housing? We've been having these conversations for years, and I kind of sometimes just wonder if we'll get to a point where we don't have to have these conversations. But yeah, those are just some thoughts that I've had in my position specifically, just around housing and just the vision for, I want to say safe, but everybody's idea of safe is very different. I think we need to also recognize that everyone's needs for where they want to live are very, very unique. And we can't just assume putting someone in a community is going to solve their problem, because it really won't. And so bigger picture, it would be great to see more supportive housing long-term with wraparound supports. It would be great to see so many more resources made available, It would also be nice to have, like, within the housing system specifically, some barriers reduced so that people don't have to, like, one example would be if somebody wants to gain access to the subsidy, they can't have a roommate. That is a barrier because people can't afford to live on their own right now. So ideally, going forward, making it so that people can afford to live on their own without needing a subsidy in order to stay housed. So those are just some of my thoughts around what housing might look like in the future. And yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Jen, can we have your vision for future housing?
Right now, we have a housing system that is based on a profit motive. System that is based on the human right of all people to be housed. In 1948, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25 stated, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." Canada signed on to that. Of course, signing on to this is aspirational. There are no penalties for not meeting the goal. Further to this, in 2008, Canada signed on to the UN Rights of Persons with Disabilities, commonly referred to as Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. Article 19 sets out the right of all disabled people to live in the community, with choices equal to others, requiring states to enable disabled people to be fully included and participate in society. Now, back to the way things are actually done. Right now, developers conglomerate parcels of land needed to build something new. People then buy or rent whatever the developer is selling. I think that North America should not expect to find the answer to the housing crisis in the market. Rather than housing being something that individuals purchase, housing should be thought of as something you use for a while. You are the keeper of the goods for a certain period of time, but know that someone else had the property before you, and someone will have the property after you. In Europe, this is a given. People should not invest in property hoping to make a quick buck. Maybe the problem with North America is that we, as colonizers, saw a vast expanse of land that was ripe for the taking. We did not think of it as the land that the indigenous people properly had the claim to. We did not thank them for cultivating and maintaining Turtle Island. It was all available. We currently see land as something that can be bought. We can stake a claim in it. The people in Europe learned generations ago that what we have is recycled from what our ancestors had. I envision a future where government provides living quarters to all residents. People would pay for their living space, but at a rate which is not exorbitant. Unless, of course, the residents want to pay for the expense. The government might own the buildings, or not, but profit is not an issue. With the new understanding of property, people can have a different idea of ownership. Ownership can be a long-term lease. If we have all the benefits of ownership, we might have a better system without the drawbacks. There would not be classes of people, the renter and the owner. We would all just be the populace.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your vision with us, Jen. And the last of our speakers for round 3 is Cheryl McIsaac.
Thank you. Man, okay, I got short of like full on just revolution and like complete system, like overhaul. That's what I'd like to see. That's what I want happening. I want to thank the other speakers too for mentioning just so much of what I want to say, particularly around just what we need is certainly an array of, there's not going to be one thing that works for everyone. Like that's just an array of options. We absolutely need to be able to provide dignified choice. I think, and Cathy mentioned this, so did Jen. I think Martha did as well. Like the private sector is not going to fix this. That's not going to happen. They can't be relied upon and shouldn't be. I think that we have to get creative and be bold as nonprofits, and we got to build stuff. And so if we are, whether that be housing or programs, so just, you know, the past 2 years, we haven't had any children in our emergency shelter because of our Diverting Families program, for instance. So that took a lot of creative thinking to make that happen, and also just building. We have to be able to build that ourselves. We're excited for, we have a new project happening right now. We've been building all this past year. Our sunflower project in Lakeside will have 25 affordable brand new units. We consulted with folks who were in our transitional housing programs in a shelter about what would they like to see, how would they like their homes to look. We'll have services on site, obviously, and supports, and also pure live-in workers, but we are building housing, thinking long-term. How can we, I mentioned before, make sure that folks who are, how can people age in place where they wouldn't necessarily have to move on just because the housing was no longer working for them? How can we build housing, or even thinking about environment? And we're thinking about costs in terms of people's heat. We're thinking about climate change in that regard. And I think that we really all need to have to dig really deep to do that. Build stuff, be bold, be creative, consult with first voice people for sure. And I loved, Jen, as you're talking about just how I think notions around housing and this individualistic view of what housing independence should look like is so super capitalist. It comes from, colonizing attitudes, and we need to do away with that and just think bigger when it comes to housing. We're really excited about the sunflower at Adsum, and the roofs are on there, the windows are in. It's going to be absolutely beautiful. It'll be a community. We're really wanting to build community and not just sticking people in apartments. It will be hopefully what we want. This is going to bring hope and dignity and choice for 25 families, and that's what we need to see more of. We need like a bazillion more of those here in Nova Scotia. So that'll do. And, you know, until we get to revolution and system overhaul, I think the sunflower, you know, will help along with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. I could feel the enthusiasm coming out of you, and it's contagious. I just imagining of many sunflower equivalents popping up across the province is a beautiful idea.
I hope so.
Mhm.
Thanks.
We have run slightly over time, and I can see a few people who are having to leave us in the chat. I'm so happy that we got to have this wonderful panel tonight and have all of these amazing voices. I really want to see your collective vision enacted in Nova Scotia. I encourage everyone here who hasn't already done so to look up that Housing for All report that Lauren has helpfully linked in the chat. It talks about principles like universal access, social inclusion, decent work and well-being, and democratization, and has those 95 recommendations for how the province can move forward, some of which are easy wins that could happen very quickly if we had the collective will. And I certainly think some of that will is with us in the room tonight. Thank you all for coming, and have a lovely evening, and enjoy the rest of your International Women's Day.
Thanks for pulling us all together, and thanks to my fellow presenters. Really appreciated it.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, Amy. Thanks, Dan. Okay.
Thanks all. I'm going to close out.